So James 2, verse 14 through 26. James 2, 14 through 26. As I said kind of in the preamble before we started, this is one of the most difficult passages in the entire Bible to interpret. And a lot of it is because we come to this passage with a lot of our own presuppositions, a lot of our preconceived notions and our biases about what we think that James is saying in James 2:14 through 26. So we think that we know what he's saying, and there's some very poor translation choices that end up causing more confusion than I think is necessary. So, and it kind of breaks into these 12 verses or whatever it is. It's kind of broke up into 3 different sections. So I'm going to walk through these sections, the first 3 or 4 verses, and then there's the section where James introduces an objector, someone who's going to come in and there's going to be quotes of somebody else saying something and objecting to what James is saying, and then he's going to come in with a rebuke and he's going to kind of finalize his point. So James 2:14 through 26, starting in verse 14. James says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can this kind of faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm, and eat well,' but you do not give them what the body needs, what good is that? So also faith, if it does not have works, is dead, being by itself." So this passage in James 2:14 through 26 is discussing faith and works. And this is the classic faith works passage. How do works coincide with our faith? How does faith affect our works? How do works affect our faith? And this is the classic passage. And people will go to this passage, and the conclusion that they'll draw is that if you truly believe the God, so this would be the traditional interpretation of James 2:14 through 26, is if you truly believed the gospel, if you truly believed in God, you would have good works coming out of your life to prove that you are born again. And that is the traditional view. That is most commentators, most pastors, most Bible teachers will tell you that is what the book of James is teaching. The book of James, verse 2:14 through 26 is teaching, rather. And I have some problems with that. I have some problems because, well, theologically, it raises some issues, which we'll get into. If we believe, which if you belong to an evangelical Protestant Christian church, your pastor likely teaches that we are saved by faith alone. It's an act of grace from God and faith by us in the work of God, and that's what saves us. So it's faith alone. Yet we're being told when we get into James 2:14 through 26 that you've got to have some good works that go along with it. And so there's classic truisms that get kind of thrown out by famous preachers. One who's a very prominent pastor said things like, "We're saved by faith alone, but you don't make it to heaven unless you've got good works." And what he's doing is he's trying to reconcile what he believes James 2:14 through 26 is actually saying. And I hope you can see that is really muddying the waters of what Paul says when we are saved by faith alone. That we're saved by faith alone, but you've got to have some good works in order to get to heaven. So that's one view. One view says, one kind of truism that says, we're saved by faith alone, but not by a faith that is alone. So it's kind of like this clever little way of articulating it. And again, that's confusing because what does that mean? A faith that is alone or not alone? And it all comes from this passage, James 2:14 through 26. But my contention is James is not talking at all about our eternal salvation. He's not talking about how to get saved, how to get right with God, how to be born again. He kind of actually gives up the goose right at the beginning. He says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but doesn't have works?" So right from the get-go, what we realize is James is discussing the profitability of faith. What good is faith without works? Is it good for anything? Well, the natural question, and you should always be asking questions of the biblical text whenever you're studying or reading the Bible. What good is it, my brethren, if you say you have faith but have no works? Can that kind of faith save? Good for what? What's the goal? What is James actually talking about? Well, he kind of says, like, he gives an example of a brother or sister who's poorly clothed and lacks in daily food. One of you says, go in peace and keep warm and eat well. But if you don't give them what the body needs, what good is that? So he's maybe drawing the attention back to the point of what he's discussing is, what good is it? How does it help? Is it profitable anyway? And again, profitable for what? Well, the example he gives is if somebody's hungry, if they're cold, if they need some clothes or they need some money or whatever, and you just tell them, go in peace, keep warm, be well fed, we might say things like, I believe that God will take care of you. Hey, God loves you and he'll provide for you, whatever. We kind of give this kind of Christian little blessing to them, and we might truly believe that God's going to take care of that person. You've probably met people who've maybe needed something. They need, $20 to put in their gas tank or whatever, and you say, well, you know what, I believe God will take care of you, and I truly believe that. I don't think that person ended up like starving and dying to death because I didn't do something to help them. God obviously provided in some way. That person got to where they needed to go, or they got what they needed. So my faith was not ill-founded. God did take care of them. They figured it out. But James's point is, if you just have that faith, but you don't do anything good, if you do no good work with your faith, what good has that done for that person? Who cares what I believe about anything? It doesn't even have to necessarily be the gospel, but who cares what I believe about God's ability to provide, God's love for that person, God's, whatever. If I don't do anything, that does nothing to the person. Kind of that talk is cheap sort of mentality. So James does say, can this kind of faith save him? And what's problematic about that is, some translations will say, can such faith save? Can this kind of a faith save him? And those words are just inserted in there. That's not really what the original Greek text says. The original Greek text just says, can faith save? And it's expected that no, faith cannot save. If you don't have works and you just have faith, faith cannot save. There is no that kind of a faith or such faith. That's not in the text. It's literally just, can faith save? And James is saying, no, faith cannot save if it does not have works. But we've got a major problem. If what James is teaching is that faith alone does not save you from hell, we have a very, very major problem. Because that directly contradicts, and we'll see this later, in Romans chapter 3, Paul says, we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. We'll see that if James is talking about salvation from hell, being born again, justified in the eyes of God, he's directly contradicting Paul. And that's where people see this problem between Paul and James, is they seem like they're contradicting. So we've got to try to figure out a way to make them fit together. So that's when you get silly things like, well, if you really have real faith, it will produce good works. So that's what James is kind of saying. If you've got good faith, yeah, it'll produce good works. And you got to have good works. And if you don't have good works, then you're not really saved. It really ends up muddying the water with this whole faith alone, grace alone message. So can this kind of a faith save him? There is no such words as kind or kind of faith, such faith. It's just, can faith save? No, it cannot. Well, can faith save what? Can faith save from what or for what? He gives you the example. He gives you the example of if a person is in distress, and that's all the word save. We hear the word save and we think, oh man, he must be talking about saved from hell, because that's how we use the word, right? Jesus saved me, or have you been saved, or are you saved, or do you want to be saved, all this kind of stuff. But the word saved is just the Greek word sozo, and it just means to be delivered. James will use the word later in James chapter 5, that if you're sick, have the elders come, they can pray over you and anoint you with oil, and the prayer of this righteous person will save, it will deliver you. Now he's not talking about saved from hell. It's clear in the context that he's talking about healing you from physical illness. And so, and that's a lot of the usage of the word sozo. A lot of the times in the gospel, when Jesus says your faith has saved you, your faith has made you well, he's talking about if you're physically sick, or you're ill, you're lame, you've got some disease or whatever, and it's their faith that has made them well. So the context always has to determine who is being saved and what are they being saved from, right? So if the context is being saved from hell, and we've got somebody saying, well, you got to have some good works in order to be saved from hell, that's a major problem as far as New Testament teaching on salvation. But if James is not talking about salvation from hell, if James is talking about some other kind of salvation, well then, salvation based on works is not that big of a problem. I always like to tell people, I've already referenced chapter 5. In chapter 5, James is teaching a salvation by works. The salvation is salvation from just being ill, being sick. And he doesn't say you can just have faith alone. If you just have faith, you'll be saved from whatever sickness you have. No, he says you've got to have some works. Namely, you've got to call the elders. The elders have to come to your house. They've got to anoint you with oil. There's got to be some prayer going on. You've got to confess your sins, maybe. That's a lot of things that you have to do in order to be saved in that context. So saved, just like any other word. I always use the example of fair. In English, we might say, she is a fair girl, and she went to a fair, and she cheated and didn't play fair. So you can use the word fair, same spelling, 3 different ways, but in the same sentence. And so the context has to kind of determine, well, what word is this person meaning? What usage of the word are they meaning? And James is saying, can faith save? If you've just got faith and no works, can faith save? And he says no. So that should tip us off right now. If we believe that the rest of the New Testament and the rest of the Bible really teaches that we are saved by faith alone, that should just tell you right away, okay, James must not be talking about salvation from hell. He must be talking about some other kind of salvation. And of course, the context tells us that he is talking about something else. The example he gives is not one of like, how do you get saved, justified, and right with God? He's talking about if somebody is hungry, if they're in need of clothing, if they're cold. They have physical needs. So if you just believe, is that going to save them? Is that going to rescue them or deliver them from whatever they have, their sickness, their poverty, their ill health, their cold? No, it's not going to deliver them. It's not going to fix their problem. You've got to add works to your faith in order for it to be profitable, which is the whole point. Remember, James starts by saying, what good is it, my brothers? What is the profit of it? And he says, so if, in verse 17, also faith, if it does not have works, is dead, being by itself. And so people think, we'll talk about dead faith, meaning like, oh, if somebody believes the gospel, but they don't end up having good works, that's because they had dead faith, and so they're not really saved, so dead faith can't really save you. That's nonsense. And we'll see by the end of this section, by dead, he just means, like this lifeless. It's not doing anything. It's not profitable. It's not good for anything, which is what James has been talking about this whole time. So he's not talking about salvation from hell. The example he uses is taking care of somebody's physical needs. And then he goes into this section in verse 18. And this is by far the most difficult part of this passage to interpret. And the reason it's hard to interpret is because it involves quotation marks and this objector saying something. He's objecting to what James's point is, and James is going to argue with him and argue back at what he's saying. And it's unclear because Greek doesn't have quotation marks. They don't have question marks. They don't have commas, periods, nothing. They don't have any punctuation marks at all. So it becomes unclear when is the objector speaking, when does he start speaking, and when does he end speaking? Because that will change the entire meaning of these couple verses, right? If he's objecting to what James is saying, and we're not getting accurately what James is actually saying and what the objector's saying, it's going to really muddy the interpretation of what they're talking about. So, okay, so I'm reading from the Net Bible, and it says, and I want to read this section, these 3 verses. It says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. Well and good. Even the demons believe that and tremble with fear. But would you like evidence, you empty fellow, that faith without works is useless?'" So James introduces the objector, somebody who's objecting to his point, and then he he comes back in, James comes back in, and rebukes the objector and says, I'm going to provide evidence, further evidence, to prove what I'm saying. The main problem is trying to understand when the objector stops speaking. So if you have a Net Bible, or I think the NIV is the same way, it will say, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. And then they stop speaking. And James resumes speaking by saying, show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that? Okay, so, and then he goes on. If you have another Bible, I think it's the NASB, has the objector saying, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And then James comes back in and says, you believe that God is one. You do good. Even the demons believe. And then there's only one translation that I have ever heard of, and it's called the Weymouth translation, that has the objector saying everything in 18 and 19. It's a very long quotation. So this objector comes in, and he's trying to basically tell James, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. So he comes in and says, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one? Well and good. Even the demons believe that, and they tremble with fear. And then James comes back in and says, would you like evidence, you empty fellow, that faith without works is useless? So the question is, how in the world do you ever determine when James is speaking and when the objector is speaking? Because, again, that does matter. And one of the reasons why it matters is because you have probably heard, and maybe you've even quoted it yourself, whenever you've got a Christian or somebody who claims to be a Christian, but they're not really doing anything for Jesus, they'll say something like, well, even the demons believe. Even the demons believe that. And they're not saved. Well, if that's not James actually saying that, if that's the objector, then we probably should stop quoting that, because James calls the objector a stupid person. He's a foolish, empty fellow. So if we find ourselves quoting somebody, that would be like, quoting from when Satan is tempting Jesus in the wilderness, and we quote the words of Satan. It's like, well, we're quoting the Bible. It's like, yeah, but you're quoting Satan. You probably shouldn't be quoting Satan. So you shouldn't be quoting the objector. Now, it's my contention that it's the longer version. That's the version that the objector is saying. He's saying, but you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. Well and good. Even the demons believe that, and they tremble with fear. Now, why do I think that he's saying all of that? This objector is saying the whole thing. Well, again, because there's no punctuation mark in the original Greek, so they couldn't just. The reader would have to know some way. They would have to have some kind of clue of when is the objector done speaking and when is James starting to speak again. And we have multiple examples in the Bible where Paul will use an objector, and it's very clear when the objector is done speaking, because Paul will come back in with like an insult and like a beat down on the objector. So in Romans 6, should we go on sinning so that grace may abound? God forbid. Like these really strong language where Paul comes back in. And the most classic one is in 1 Corinthians 15. He'll say, well, somebody will say, with what kind of body do the dead do they come? Like what kind of body do you have when you're resurrected? And it's kind of like an insulting way of saying, if you're going to come back from the dead and be resurrected, what kind of body is that person going to have? And Paul immediately says, you fool, that which is sown is not the same as that which is raised. So he comes in with a strong rebuke, you fool. So it kind of gives you this indicator that a writer in the Bible will introduce an objector. Again, it's just this made-up literary device, this person who's objecting to the main point. And they're saying something stupid and contrary to truth. Otherwise, why use the literary device, right? You're basically introducing a devil's advocate so that you can call them an idiot and tell them that they're stupid. So James is doing the same thing. He's introducing this objector who will say something very stupid. And then James comes in and says, but would you like evidence, you idiot, you empty-headed fellow, that faith without works is useless? So that's my contention, is that all those verses, 18 and 19, you have faith, I have works, show me your faith without works, I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. Well and good, even the demons believe and tremble with fear. That's all the objector. That is a stupid, empty-headed person saying something, thinking that he's, oh, ha, ha, I'll get a one-over on James and prove him wrong. But he's saying something that's stupid. So keep that in mind. A lot of the times we'll say that, well, hey, even the demons believe, as if we've made some great theological point. But James is saying, no, you're an idiot for saying that. So maybe we should remove that from our jargon as Christians. But what is the objector trying to say? And that's very unclear, because it is unclear what he's trying to say. And I always tell people the best way to determine what the objector, what the devil's advocate is saying, is to look at what James is rebuking him with. Okay, so James comes in and says, would you like evidence, you idiot, that faith without works is useless? So if that's what James is saying as the rebuke, what must the objector be trying to say? The objector must be saying that faith without works is profitable, that it is good, that it's okay. That it's okay to have faith without works. Now, again, we know that because James says the opposite. So the example I always use is if somebody was to log on to TikTok right now and jump onto this live stream, right as I say, hey, you idiot, do you want evidence that Nickelback is the worst band on the planet? You wouldn't even had to have known. I don't think that Nickelback's the worst band on the planet, but that's neither here nor there. But you wouldn't have had to have known anything that was said before to know that I must be responding to somebody who said that Nickelback is not the worst band on the planet, that they're good, that they're okay to listen to, whatever. That must have been what their contention was, because I'm saying, hey, you idiot, would you like evidence that Nickelback's the worst band on the planet? So in the same way, we know that James is saying, do you want evidence, you idiot, that faith without works is useless? So the objector must be saying that faith without works is okay. And if I was to guess at what the objector's trying to say, the whole you have faith, I have works, show me your faith without works, I'll show you my faith by my works. What he's trying to say is, James is saying, hey, faith and works, they need to go together. Like, to be helpful, to be a good minister of the gospel, to be profitable as a Christian, to be useful as a Christian, we've got to have faith and works. I'm assuming that he must be saying something like, the objector must be saying something like, you've got faith, I've got works. Nah, you can show me your faith without works. I can show you my faith by my works. Is there really much of a connection between faith and works? I mean, James, you've got faith with no works. I got a lot of works. I'm this social justice warrior type Christian. I've got a lot of works. I do a lot of good stuff for the poor. Yeah, Jesus, whatever. I'll take him or leave him. I don't know if I got really faith in who God is, but I've got works, James. You've got faith. We're both good people. We're trying to serve Jesus, whatever. He seems to be saying something like that faith and works aren't really all that connected. And then he says, the objector also says, you believe that God is one, so that's the Shema. That's what every good Jewish person believed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one, God is one. He's like, you believe that God is one. That's good, well and good. Even the demons believe that, and they tremble with fear. Now, what's amazing is people will read that and say, well, see, the demons also believe, but they don't have good works, so they don't really believe. And so people will say, well, you've got demonic faith. If you don't really have good works as a Christian, you must have this demonic faith. When I read this, I don't see that the objector is saying that the demons don't really believe. He's not saying that, well, the demons say that God is one. The demons say that they have faith, but they've got some whacked out demonic faith. They don't really believe. No. In fact, I think he's actually saying the demons truly do believe. It's not that the demons don't believe, that they only have like head knowledge and no heart knowledge, and they're fake confessors but not possessors or whatever, or all this nonsense that we say as Christians. The demons really do believe that God is one, that God is real. How do we know that? Because they tremble with fear. Think about when Jesus came across the demon-possessed man in the Gospels. That the demons threw the man to the ground, and they were terrified, saying, are you going to punish us before our time? Please don't send us into, the abyss. Send us into this one. They were terrified because they knew exactly who Jesus was. So it's not that the demons, they just say they believe, but they have no good works. What the objector is saying is that the demons truly do believe. And they don't do good. So like James believes that God is one. And that causes James to serve God and to love other people and preach the gospel and all this kind of stuff. The demons truly believe, and they shudder with fear. So what is the objector trying to say? I think just like before, when he's saying there's not really much connection between faith and works, and how can you say that they're connected? How can you say that they need to go together? He's saying, like, James, you believe one thing and you act a certain way. The demons believe the exact same thing and they behave a different way. So how can you really say that faith and works have to go together when you can have such divergent works from the same faith, from the same content of faith? I think that that's what the objector must be saying. But James is saying, you idiot. How can you, do you want evidence that faith without works is useless? And again, that's been the point he's been trying to say this whole time, is that faith without works is useless. It's no good. No good for what? To be saved, i.e. delivered from hell, rescued from our sins, born again? No, faith without works is perfectly fine for that. That's all you need is faith. In fact, when you read Romans chapter 4, Paul makes it very clear that we are saved by faith alone, apart from works. Ephesians 2:8 and 9, we're saved by grace through faith. This is not of yourselves, lest anyone should boast. So it is faith alone. So James is not talking about how to be right with God. He is talking about something different. He's talking about, in order to be profitable, in order to be a good human, if you even want to make it that broadly, in order to be somebody who's helpful to other people who are hungry, are cold, and in need of maybe a roof over their head, faith alone's not good enough. That doesn't do anyone any good. You've got to have some good works. And so in this last section, he goes into this Abraham, Rahab, and body soul illustration thing. So he says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Now that's an important qualifier that James puts in here. When you read Paul, and Paul's teaching about how to be saved by faith apart from works, he goes to Abraham and uses Abraham as an example, but he goes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. When God made a promise to Abraham, look up into the sky and look at the stars. That's how many descendants you're going to have. And it says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abraham did no good work other than just believe God. And Paul takes that to teach that we are saved by faith alone. James, though, is not talking about how did Abraham get right with God? How did Abraham get his sins forgiven? How did Abraham, get into a right relationship with God? If he was talking about that, he would probably, with Paul, say back in Genesis 15, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. But he's saying, wasn't Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? So he makes it very clear he's talking about a different point in Abraham's life. He's in fact talking about a point in Abraham's life that's some 25 years later, after he initially believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Decades later, God calls on him to offer his son. And of course, if you don't know, go and read Genesis 22 for that story. But this was a very profound, difficult thing for Abraham to do. But God called on him to sacrifice his son. He went to go do it. And of course, God stopped him and said, hey, don't sacrifice your son, right as he was about to stab him. And so Abraham didn't do it. But so it was at that point that Abraham, our father, was justified by works. And justified and righteous, they're really the same word in Greek. To be just or to be justified is the same thing as being righteous or doing righteousness. So wasn't Abraham righteous? Wasn't he good? Wasn't he just when he offered, when he believed God and actually acted on it to be willing to offer his son? And we would look at that and say, wow, yeah, that would be very difficult. That would be a very difficult thing to do. Man, I don't know that I would be able to do that. But look, man, Abraham was really able to do that. And it goes on to say, you see that his faith was working together with his works, and his faith was perfected by his works. So this is this other point that I think James is trying to make, was it was at that point that Abraham's faith basically almost like skyrocketed. It matured. This is this word. It was perfected. It was teleos. It found its purpose at that point, and it was matured. That's a really good way to think of the word teleos. It was perfected. It was matured when he sacrificed his son Isaac, or was willing to, and he saw God provide. it must have just catapulted Abraham's faith to this whole new level. And that's another point that I think James is going to be making, is not only do we have to have works in order to be helpful to other people, works also profit us because it really bolsters our faith. And we'll see that here at the end of this chapter. So you see that faith was working together with his works, and his faith was perfected by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that said Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. So that's another point, that friends of God don't just believe God, but they also do what he says. So this is kind of probably reminiscent of Jesus saying, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, that kind of thing. But also this idea that it was at this point when Abraham showed his faith, that he actually acted out his faith, that him and God actually became kind of buddies. They became friends at that point. He was born again before that. He had right standing with God. God was his savior, all that kind of stuff. That happened way back in Genesis 15. But in Genesis 22, when he was willing to offer his son Isaac as an offering, it was at that point that God said, now you're my friend, Abraham. Now we're buds. So he says, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So again, if James is talking about how to be saved from hell, we've got a major problem, because that verse directly contradicts Romans 3:28, where Paul says, we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. And that is something that we adamantly teach as Christians, is that we are saved by faith, not works. Works do not play any role in our salvation, in our justification. Well, here we've got James saying, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So what do we do with this? How do we reconcile this? Well, here's my suggestion. James is writing really early on in the life of the church. Paul got saved he met Christ probably about a year and a half after Jesus' resurrection, 34, 35 AD. And then we're told in Galatians it was another 17, 18 years before Paul really went on his missionary journeys. He went out into the wilderness. He spent some time studying. The resurrected Christ appeared to him there and was telling him the gospel. So at that point, it was close to 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus Christ that Paul really began going out and spreading the gospel. So we're looking at 50, 53 AD before Paul goes out. And most people believe James was probably writing closer to the late 30s, maybe early 40s AD. Probably when Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 7 and 8, and he was sent out, and all the Christians dispersed at that point because of the persecution. Probably James is writing shortly after that to all of the Christians that have been scattered abroad. So very early on. So James he has no concept that Paul's going to be teaching we're saved by faith alone without works of the gospel. So he's not contradicting Paul. He's just writing the truth as he sees it. And remember, this word justified doesn't necessarily mean, as Paul will use it later, meaning justified, saved from our sins, believing in Jesus Christ, born again, all this kind of stuff, having a right standing with God. He's just saying justified, like Noah was a righteous man, Abraham was a righteous man, all this language of just being righteous or being just. I think that's how James is using it. He's just saying, you see, a person is just. They're righteous. They're a righteous person. They are a good person, if we want to use kind of unchurchy language, just talking about, that's a good person. That person, we don't call a person good just because they say, well, I believe in God. If they're a terrible person, if they're harming people and hurting people and abusing people and they're not doing any good works, we wouldn't call that person a righteous person. They might be judicially righteous before God because they believe the gospel or something, but we wouldn't say that's a good person. I think James is just saying, hey, listen, you see a person's good, they're justified, they're righteous, they're a righteous person, not just by faith alone, but by what they do. And then he goes on to this Rahab illustration. He says, and similarly, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another way? So Rahab, this is down now into the book of Joshua. They're coming into the promised land, and Jericho was the first city they encountered. And this is when all the walls fell down, but they sent in the spies. And Rahab hid the spies because she was basically like, hey, listen, we got news out of Egypt that you guys are going to come in and destroy everyone here, and we're terrified. So could you spare me and my family? So she hid the spies. She hid them, and when they came to the door, hey, do you have any Israeli spies in here? Rahab was like, no, we don't. And she let them escape out a different way. And it says she was a prostitute, and she was literally a lying prostitute. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, why in the world does James use Rahab as an illustration? There are so many examples in the Old Testament of people who were good, right? He could have gone to David. He could have gone to Solomon. He could have gone to Isaac or Jacob or any of the fathers, the forefathers of Israel. He could have gone to anyone. Why did he go to Rahab? Well, remember, James's whole point in James 2:14 through 26 is that faith alone is fine according to Paul when it comes to justification and salvation from God, salvation from God from our sins. Faith alone is fine for that. But as far as doing good in the world, faith alone is not good enough. You can't just say, well, I believe God and I've got good beliefs and that just will solve everything. He's saying, no, you got to have some good works. And Rahab actually becomes a perfect example of that. Rahab truly believed that God was the biggest God on the block. He was going to rock the Canaanites when the Israelites crossed that Jordan River into the Promised Land. She truly believed that. But if Rahab had not hid the spies, protected them, sent them out by another way, and actually did something about her faith, she would have literally died when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. So Rahab, like what James said earlier, you see that faith alone will not save you. It won't rescue you. It won't deliver you. It won't save other people. It won't rescue. Rahab is actually a perfect illustration of that. Her faith alone would not have saved the spies, wouldn't have saved her family. They would have all died. But she did something. She added works to her faith, and it actually saved her life. So I want to just wrap up this section with this last verse. And to me, this is the most encouraging part of understanding James 2:14 through 26 in a non-traditional way. Not the way that your pastor maybe has said it, or something where you said, well, if you've really got good works, or if you've really got faith, you'll have good works. And then you end up thinking, well, do I have good works? Do I have enough good works? How many good works do I have to have? Were they good enough works, or were they kind of just okay works? And if you're anything like me or a lot of people, if you have that belief, you end up torn. Like, what do I do if I don't think I have enough good works, but I think that I'm saved? Do I have to get saved again? Do I have to believe the gospel again? How do I do that if I already believe it? But, so we end up being confused and scared that we don't really know God because we don't have enough good works. To me, that's terrible. That is a terrible slavery to put people under, is that kind of fear. When you really truly understand that all James is saying in James 2:14 through 26 is that if you add works to your faith, it's good and it's profitable for you and for other people. How's it good for you? Well, it matures your faith. Like Abraham, his faith was perfected. It was matured. He grew in his faith because he did something, right? And then here at the end it says, just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. So think of a body that has no spirit anymore, okay? So my dad just recently passed away, and when my mom and I went up to the hospital after he passed, we went into the room that he was in, and his body was just laying there on his bed, lifeless. His spirit had gone out of the body at that point. So it was still his body. If someone was to come in and say, is that William Sutherby's body? Yes, it is still his body. It is a very real body, but it's dead. The life has gone out of it, okay? And the same thing is true of faith. If you are somebody who believes the gospel, but you have no works, that doesn't mean your faith is not real, that it's not genuine faith, that it's not real faith, that it's not saving faith. It's just dead faith. It's not doing anything. But if you add works to it, works, the spirit, if you add the spirit to your body, your faith, it will actually give life to the body. The spirit is what gives life to the body. And isn't that amazing that this verse actually teaches the exact opposite of what people traditionally think James 2:14 through 26 is teaching. People typically think that James is saying, if you really have faith, it will give life and rise to good works. And James is actually saying, no, if you've got good works, it will give life to your faith. And so that's kind of what he said about Abraham, right? Abraham did something, and it energized his faith. It matured his faith. It perfected his faith. And think about it in your own life. I know this is true of me. Whenever I have an opportunity like this to teach the Bible. I'm doing something. I'm exercising my spiritual gift. It excites me. It gives life to my faith. It energizes my faith. Coming up next month, our church has church camp, and if you grew up in the church, you probably have gone to summer camp before. When you go to summer camp, you're around other Christians, you're singing songs, you're hearing the Bible taught, you're having fun with other people, and you always come back and you're ready to take on the world. You've got that camp spirit, that camp energy, and sometimes it wanes off throughout the year, and you're gonna go back to normal. But for a little bit, man, you were really energized. And what has happened is what James says is supposed to happen. You were doing something for Jesus, and it energized your faith in the same way that a spirit will energize someone's body. When you're doing something for the Lord, it energizes your faith. It gives life to your faith. And so to me, that is such an encouraging application of what James is really saying in James 2:14 through 26. Not that you better make sure that you've got good works, otherwise you're going to go to hell because you don't have enough good works to prove that you're saved, and you probably aren't saved because you don't have enough good works. None of that nonsense. It's just saying, if you add works to your faith, if you do something, your faith walk with God will go from being something that's dead, kind of lifeless, it's not doing anyone any good, to having life and life in abundance and being rejuvenated and giving life to other people. So when you've got people, like he said in the beginning, that are hungry, they're thirsty, they need some clothes, you're so full of life that you can share that life with them, and they're energized and they're helped out by it. Like Rahab with the spies, she helps them because she's going to do something that's going to energize her faith, and it's going to help the spies, and it's going to rescue her family too, and Abraham becomes a friend of God. It's just your faith just skyrockets and matures when you add works to your faith. And I think that's all that James is saying. It's no more complicated than that. It's no more difficult than that. James is a very practical book, and this is a very practical message. Add works to your faith, and it will energize your faith. It will mature your faith, and it will mature your walk with the Lord. So that's what I have for James 2:14 through 26. Hope you enjoyed it, and as I said, I'll put it out as a podcast next week, and I'll share that link on here. And we'll see next Saturday. Maybe we'll take on another passage from the Bible. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission. If you like what you heard on this episode, why don't you become a monthly supporter of the ministry? It really helps me out. $10 a month, or whatever the Lord lays on your heart. So if you're interested in becoming a partner, you can text the word discipleship to 41444, or head over to infaith.org/Dennis-Sutherby. And if you have any questions or topics that you would like me to address on a future episode of Faith in Focus, why don't you shoot me an email? You can email me at dennissutherby@infaith.org. Just put in the subject line, question for Faith in Focus, or something like that. So I can see it, know that it's from you, and know that it's an issue that you would like me to address.